years since the onset of polio, every hour of every day had been affected by this incapacity. To understand Roosevelt the president, it is important to take a journey into his past, to chart a personal odyssey of courage and triumph over adversity. It was a journey FDR took himself in the summer of 1933. On June 29th, the president left Washington sailing north into open waters toward his summer home on the Canadian island of Campobello, off the coast of Maine.
Say, grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worries back on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street.
Only his most inner circle knew this was the place he had been avoiding for 12 years, avoiding the memories of the summer of 1921, when he arrived a vigorous man of 39 and left a cripple. The holiday that year started like any other, an idyllic time where the summer days lingered and memories were shaped by the winds and the tides.
I enjoyed the Campobello life. I loved the picnics. I loved sailing to different places. You would always find new places to sail to. There were so many places you could explore and go to. My husband loved it. He was a wonderful sailor. He knew the whole coast intimately.
On the sunny side of the street.
FDR's nightmare began with a simple chill the family attributed to a late afternoon swim.
And in his wet bathing suit, Frankie sat with the mail which had come while they were out. And after a very short time, it was getting near to supper time, he started to go upstairs and said his back ached and didn't feel very well. I suggested that he go to bed and I would bring him his supper. And that was really the beginning of his illness. By the next morning, he could hardly stand, and by the next day, he could not stand at all.
For 2 days, Roosevelt stayed in his room as the paralysis continued to spread from his legs to his hips, his chest, his arms, and his shoulders. FDR was in excruciating pain, but the local doctor wasn't sure why. He told Eleanor to relieve the discomfort by rubbing her husband's sore limbs.
With polio, every nerve cell in your body is inflamed. It's not a matter of losing sensation. It's a matter of having acute sensation. So by massaging his muscles, she was forcing them to exercise at a time when they were terribly sick. And she may, in fact, have hastened the paralysis by doing that.
Dr. Robert Lovett, a specialist in infantile paralysis, was called in from Boston. He immediately diagnosed polio.
He lay very quiet after Dr. Lovett left and seemed to be facing what this meant. He never said anything at all.
All his life, FDR idolized his distant cousin Teddy, dreamed that someday he would follow his hero into the White House. But as he lay in his room at Campobello, such thoughts appeared perverse reflections on what might have been.
You have to recognize that polio in those days carried a social stigma, like a venereal disease. People were put away when they had polio. And so to find your husband, your father, with polio must have been a huge shock to the family.
Returning to Hyde Park, he refused to accept that the paralysis might be permanent. Recovery was just a matter of time and patience. He hoped to find both here, at his home alongside the Hudson River.
He would spend a good part of the day with his braces on and his crutches, trying to walk all the way to the end of the driveway.
And he would drag himself along and back and forth and back and forth, sweating buckets. I mean, it was not just an impossible task, you know, in terms of muscles, but it was painful. And the sad thing, and to me, just, I don't know how he put up with it, is to recognize that he was not making any progress through all of the physical therapy that he was engaging in.
Eleanor watched Franklin day after day as he tried and failed to reach the end of the driveway. It was, she said, a trial by fire. His strength and his natural optimism seemed to be on the wane.
He had said to her just once, "I'm a useless person, and I'll always be a burden."
For the first time in his life, FDR was experiencing serious depression. He would now have to confront his own demons. In the winter of 1924, FDR purchased a 71-foot houseboat he christened the LaRuco. He sailed her around the Florida Keys for months with his secretary and companion Marguerite LeHand, known to everyone as Missy. It was a time to reflect on what he had lost. Polio had stopped a promising political career in its tracks. In 1910, Roosevelt had been elected to the New York State Senate. Then, in April 1913, President Woodrow Wilson selected him to become an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Finally, in 1920, he ran unsuccessfully as his party's vice presidential candidate. Now, with Missy at his side, he faced the greatest obstacle of his life. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained in New York with their 5 children, aged 8 to 18. But she told friends he needed to find some way of returning to the political arena. "I don't want him forgotten," she said. "I want him to have a voice." But Roosevelt believed he could never return to elected office in a wheelchair, or while he remained on crutches. Then he was told about the Warm Springs Resort in Georgia that appeared to offer the possibility of a cure. In the shadow of Pine Mountain, Georgia, the town of Warm Springs had long been a retreat for the rich, taking advantage of the waters that bubble up at a constant 88 degrees. Although never possessing medicinal properties, the open-air pools were an ideal retreat for hundreds of polios, able to exercise for hours in the warm water. Disability was a given. Everyone had a cross to bear.
He was surrounded by fellow polios, and he didn't have to pretend with them. He always used a wheelchair. He was very active socially. He had a good time. There were occasions when he'd drive to a party in one of the cottages and no one was around to carry him in. He could bounce down to the ground and with his hands bounce his butt along to get into the cottage, and he didn't think a thing about it. That's why he kept going to Warm Springs.
Roosevelt built a home at Warm Springs, but the children rarely visited their father, and Eleanor, disliking the segregated South, came infrequently and didn't stay long. It was Missy who remained with Franklin for the weeks that turned into years. This was 1,000,000 miles from his world along the Hudson River. He would often drive away from Warm Springs, travel the byways of Georgia, and encounter an America he had never known before. The rural white underclass fighting for survival. Black tenant farmers beaten down by generations of bigotry and oppression. FDR was beginning to develop empathy for the underdog.